Welcome to today's panel with the Atlantic Council. I am Bethany Allen Abrahamian. I will be your moderator for today. I am the China reporter with Axios, coming to you live from Taipei, Taiwan. Today, we're going to be discussing the meeting that was held last week between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in Moscow, the latest of many meetings between these two world leaders and good friends, as they have called each other. To set the scene for us today, I would like to first go to our panelists, and I will introduce them to you. We have Jill Dougherty, a global fellow with the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center and a former CNN foreign affairs correspondent. We have Ambassador John Herbst, senior director at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and the former US ambassador to Ukraine. We have Michael Schumann, non-resident senior fellow at the Global China Hub with the Atlantic Council. And finally, we have David Schulman, who is the senior director at the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to start out by asking Jill to set the scene for us. What are the major headlines leading up to this meeting, and what was on everyone's minds as these two powerful men were meeting?
Yes, well, I would say let's start with maybe the objectives of each side. And again, I'm not a China expert, I'm a Russia expert, but that said, I did watch it pretty closely. So I would say Putin had, as Xi did, short and long-term objectives. For Putin, I think number one was to show he had friends. After all, he had been, the ICC had issued a warrant for his arrest as a war criminal, so never hurts to have an international leader coming to Moscow. He was seeking diplomatic and political support, as well as technical and military support for the war that he is waging in Ukraine. And then finally, I think seeking a lot of trade agreements to continue that relationship, which has increased. And then Xi, for his part, number one, energy, keep the energy flowing from Russia, and also burnishing his role as a peacemaker, because he came to Moscow with a 12-point peace program, not a lot of details of that, and he was just, off his brokering an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, reestablishing relations. So that was important. And then I think for both of them, there was the objective, almost a rhetorical, philosophical objective of trying to criticize the unipolar world, as Mr. Putin constantly refers to it, the United States controlling the world and telling the world what to do. And now both sides would say it's a multipolar world. And then, the extraordinary circumstances, I think also that ICC warrant and the United States, just as this is happening, warning very strongly, don't provide China. Mr. Xi, do not provide lethal weapons to Russia. So the outcomes, and my colleagues can get into this more than I can, but I would say Xi obviously did get some type of tacit agreement that the plan for ending the war in Ukraine, as Mr. Putin said, could be the basis for ending the war. But then he said, but the West isn't ready. And they obviously got trade agreements. And also President Putin, interestingly, got kind of an endorsement by Xi for his run in 2024 for the presidency of Russia again. And then finally, lots of trade agreements. And I would probably end with, it appears that Putin did not get those lethal weapons. And I would also say we've got some warning signs that, disagreements such as President Putin announcing that he was going to provide nuclear weapons to Belarus, something that both agreed just a few days ago, that should not be done, that nuclear weapons should not be provided outside of the boundaries of the country. So maybe I'll stop there, but I think those are the highlights for me.
Thank you so much, Jill. I think we've gotten a good perspective on what both sides were trying to accomplish with this meeting. I want to dive in a little bit more deeply onto the China side, on Xi Jinping's side. So I'm going to ask both Michael and David, and maybe we can start with David. What were the biggest concerns or the biggest hopes that Xi Jinping had going into this? And also, what was the US nervous about on the Chinese side? So, for example, there had been several headlines in the past week or 2 weeks, I'd say, about some Chinese-made weapons that had made their way into Russia. Unclear yet if that was official Chinese aid or not. But David, maybe start with you on the stakes of this for Xi Jinping and what he hopes to accomplish.
Great, thank you, Bethany. And I think Jill set the scene very well on both sides. I think the expectation that Xi Jinping was going to come to Moscow and that his goal was going to be to somehow actually create peace and resolve the conflict, I think was a bit of a misnomer. I think what we should get out of this latest visit is a true understanding of the fact that China intends to deepen its relationship with Russia and has done so over the last year in many ways, despite the fact that we've seen Putin unleashing this war on Ukraine. Xi's goals coming into this meeting, therefore, weren't really about peacemaking necessarily. They were more about, as Jill intimated, establishing more alignment with Russia in terms of their joint struggle, as they view it, against the United States, and from China's perspective, this protracted global competition that it expects to engage with the United States on for years to come. And Russia is really the only key partner in that competition that matters for China, the most important strategic partner for a variety of reasons that we can get into. But then also really putting out there this vision of a new global order and a revisionist approach to international institutions, which China views the United States as having unfairly dominated and dominating really the narrative globally, really trying to shape discourse in a different direction with Russia as a partner. And we saw that in multiple statements that came out of this visit, including this notion of, as Xi Jinping puts it, we're seeing changes unseen in a century that are occurring in the international order right now, and Russia and China together are going to push that forward. And that effectively means the decline of the United States in the West and the rise of China and the rise of a non-democratic order where human rights and the values that the United States has espoused and our democratic allies as well will be watered down, and you effectively get a values agnostic global order. So that was the kind of macro point of what Xi Jinping's trying to achieve here. In addition to, as Jill said, really this, and there's no better word for it, I think this kind of chutzpah in terms of China continuing to support Russia's war machine, yes, not with direct lethal weapons, and I'll get to that in a second, but in all these other ways, short of actually violating sanctions and damaging China's interests over the last year, and supporting Russia rhetorically, blaming the US and NATO for fanning the flames of the war, while at the same time coming in and using this so-called peace plan that China has mooted to try to paint China as a peacemaker, as was mentioned, building on the success of brokering an initial rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. So the ability that China had to kind of get good press about being this peacemaker, this responsible global player, even as they are effectively supporting Russia's war machine in many different ways. I think that's been a key goal for Xi generally, but especially coming out of this visit. I think, on the specific issue of lethal weapons that you raised, yes, the US is very concerned that China is going to provide direct lethal aid to Russia. And I think we're all watching and waiting to see whether that happens. My personal belief is that if China does do it, they will do it in a way that is at least some plausible deniability and go through cutouts. But I think it's really important to note, again, that the way in which China has supported Russia and given it an economic lifeline over the last year, as Western sanctions have been placed on Russia, is really significant. Money is fungible, and the fact that Russia can use some of that funds that it has to support its continuing punitive aggression against Ukraine is truly significant. Lethal weapons would be a step beyond that, but I think we should first and foremost recognize that.
Thank you so much. And before I turn to Michael, I would like to remind the audience that we will be having a Q&A portion later in this session. So you can use the Q&A function in the window there, submit questions, and I will be selecting some of those questions to pose to the panelists in the last 15 to 20 minutes. Michael, for you, can you talk to us a little bit about how China's relationship with Russia, how China's support for Russia and China's opposition to the West has played domestically in China. Now, there's limits to how much we know about that because of censorship, but how has this played domestically?
Well, I think from the Chinese perspective, the relationship with Russia is basically all good at this stage. This is not an equal relationship. China is in a stronger position. Xi Jinping is kind of the alpha of the relationship with Putin. Putin has been shown, and Russia has been shown to be, I think, a declining power, and he has limited options because of the way he's cut off his relations with the West. This gives China very much an upper hand in dictating where this relationship is going to be going, that gives China a level of leverage and control over a country that can be a very important partner in its greater agenda, as David was talking about pushing back against the United States and changing the global order. As you said, it's very hard to know how all this plays domestically because of the nature of censorship, and we don't have free discussion. Because of that, I think there's actually widespread support here in China, from what we could tell, for Xi Jinping's opposition in regard to Russia, as well as in regard to the Ukraine conflict and the United States. This is what Xi Jinping is doing is part of a greater narrative that he's trying to create that is for a domestic audience, but also a global audience, that China is the country of peace. China has solutions to a world that's in chaos, and the United States is a country of war that can no longer lead the world, and you can see that by the chaos like the Ukraine war going on around us. So this narrative is all part of China's the Xi Jinping's greater message to the Chinese people, that China is undergoing this in a great national rejuvenation, is rising on the world stage, is gaining an influence around the world. And the relationship with Russia, the attitude towards the US, the attitude towards the Ukraine war is all part of that story.
One thing that I think has really struck me over the past year is the degree to which support for Russia has played on the Chinese internet, which is, of course, highly censored. But there does seem to be, in addition to the censorship, a lot of genuine Chinese nationalist support for this because of what all three of you have said so far, this sense that China and Russia are banding together to push back against the evil West or the imperialist West. It's really playing about that. So little of the discussion is, in China at least, is really about Ukraine. So, John, I would like to turn to you from the perspective of the Ukrainians. How are they viewing the meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and in general, China's role in this whole affair?
Certainly, the Ukrainians looked with some trepidation at Xi's trip to Russia. And they understood the things that have already been mentioned on this panel, that Putin was demonstrating or trying to demonstrate that he's not alone, that he has an important bastion of support. And they don't like that. But the Ukrainians are very interesting in their approach to China. They understand that China is Moscow's crucial ally in this war, but they also are trying to maintain some connection with Beijing, and hoping that somehow China will decide to reverse its policy of support for Russia. That's why they have not really condemned China at all since the big invasion began, or for that matter, before that. That's why they've been very careful in their characterization of the so-called peace plan. They pointed out there are elements in the peace plan which they like. Behind closed doors, they are obviously deeply concerned that it might gain some momentum. But not willing again to challenge China on this. They'll leave it to others, to us, to do that.
And would you say that is because they are hoping, they want to leave diplomatic space, a public diplomatic space, for Beijing to still come around and be less publicly pro-Russia?
That's part of it, but there's a tendency you see in the policymaking of this government in Kiev. They've also been very, very cautious in their approach to Lukashenko in Belarus for the same reasons. While they don't like the support that Belarus is being forced to provide, I think that's probably the best way to put it, by the Kremlin in the war, they are concerned that if they took on Lukashenko frontally, that might make him be more amenable to doing the Kremlin's bidding. And I think it's a similar logic with China, albeit for somewhat different reasons.
Jill, I want to turn back to you on the Russian side. One thing that I hear sometimes from people is they say, well, Russia is secretly resentful, or even Russians, the people themselves, are secretly resentful. But now in this relationship, they seem to be the younger brother, the junior partner in a China-Russia, not axis or alliance, but the relationship there. Have you seen that? Have you noticed that? Is there that sense of resentment?
Yeah, I think that it is a kind of a split approach. One is they're very happy to have China on their side. China has come in, initially when the war started, they were providing credit cards. Russians, you couldn't use Visa or MasterCard. So the Chinese were providing credit cards. But, in terms of what they need, cell phones, things that they can't get because of sanctions, they're kind of happy to get those because it's consumer. But when you get into how they actually feel about this, I think there's, concern, trepidation about becoming the junior partner. And the farther east you get in Russia, I've been out to areas, very far in the east, and there's more concern that, China has many more people. China has much more economic power, and we could just simply be, overcome by China. So I do think some of this is, deep. It goes back into history. We have to remember they actually had a border war during the Cold War. So I would say it's a split approach.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that Putin's interest is in a Chinese brokered peace plan, if he has true interest in that?
I don't think the peace plan is so broad that, and the details fit him. And Xi is not requiring that Russia remove its troops from Ukraine. So it's pretty much kind of an endorsement. It's kind of, let's freeze it in place and hope for peace. It's never going to work. And I don't think anybody really believes, including Putin, that it would work. But it's out there. It's rhetorical. It shows, as was pointed out by our panelists, that Xi wants peace, that China is a peace-loving country, and also that Putin wants peace, except that he's going to blame the other side for not wanting it. Therefore, nothing can happen. So I don't think there's any great hope that this is realistic. But it works well in a PR way.
Yeah, that makes me curious about who is the audience for all this PR. If we're having these meetings, we're doing this PR. It's not just surely Chinese and Russians themselves. Who are the other countries they're talking to, and what are their goals there vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And Jill, start with you, and I would like to open this question up to all of the panelists, because I think you will all bring interesting perspectives to this.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's the world, and it's also the developing world, the global South, because Russia right now in this war in Ukraine has really broadened it, to an existential issue. And part of their message is we are on the side of the developing world, the global South, that is chafing against the United States, which really is controlling Ukraine and is really behind this war. So in that sense, by saying, we have a friend, China, we are going to change the relationship. It's no longer going to be a unipolar world. It will be a multipolar world. I think that's their audience. It's really the entire world. I do think they have problems when they get into the specifics. You know, I mean, I won't go too deeply, but the use of the yuan, the current Chinese currency, which is increasing, is a problem, for, I would say, for India. So, you know, you do have these contradictions, but in general, it's the world.
I'll just jump in as well, Bethany, and say
Please
I
do.
think that's exactly right what Jill said for both sides. I think from China's perspective, yes, the focus on the global South is something that we've been watching for a while now, but we've really seen a ramp up in this over the last year, and the messaging that's directed towards the developing world around you know, how China and Russia are approaching this war, and this notion of indivisible security, this notion of that Russia's reasonable security interests need to be respected. And this notion that effectively, even though the United States and Europe, we feel like we're doing what clearly ought to be done to defend a sovereign democracy from an illegal, all-out invasion from Russia. That is not necessarily how a lot of the global South is seeing it. And this messaging from China and Russia about the United States and about how we're, keeping this war going, we're fanning the flames by continuing to support Ukraine, while China is all in on anything that can lead us towards peace and a ceasefire. And why don't you support peace? Why don't you support ending a war? Leaving aside the fact that, of course, that would freeze in place what Russia has achieved through its aggression in Ukraine. That can be highly effective in a lot of places. And this, dovetails nicely with what China is trying to do in terms of really painting itself again, kind of going back to its history of trying to be the leader of the developing world, putting out these new initiatives, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, that really are meant to effectively replace the US-led global order with one that where China plays a bigger role, where we have, again, this notion of a more multilateral, more multipolar, world, one that's more small d democratic, and they use that term frequently. And so China thinks that this messaging is highly effective. One other thing I'll note too, though, is some people are saying, well, this means that China has kind of abandoned and given up on Europe as well. I don't think that that's the case. I think that China, Xi Jinping thinks that he can have his cake and eat it too, that despite the stronger line we've seen out of Europe, especially out of the EU Commission over the last year on China, as a result of its support for Russia, in addition to many other things that kind of have been happening over the last few years, that Europe is still in play, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, Europe needs that economic relationship with China and will not fundamentally side with the United States in a more united transatlantic response to China. And all these visits that we're seeing from European leaders to China only underscores that point.
I mean, at the same time, if I can jump in here, I agree with David, but I also would like to add that I think what you're seeing in this messaging out of China in regard to Russia and Ukraine, and as David said, the international world order as it is more broadly, I think it is a major shift in the direction of Chinese foreign policy, where basically since the start of the reform era, China's foreign policy has been very much about building relationships with the U.S. and its partners, and has very much benefited from those relationships. I think now Xi Jinping is seeing it's the West in basically very much opposite terms. That the U.S. and its partners are hell bent on containing China, and the only way that China is going to achieve the great rejuvenation that it desires and deserves is to basically chart a new foreign policy, and that means creating a new world order, and that means redirecting its efforts, primary efforts, away from the West and towards the global South, and creating new coalitions and new partnerships that are in an area I think the Chinese see as more fertile ground for kind of Chinese principles of diplomacy and human rights and democracy, and a lot of the ideas that China is propagating in the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and if it's in its messaging about the Ukraine war, can actually gain some ground in certain parts of the developing world, especially among other authoritarian countries or countries that have mixed feelings about the United States and its push for democratic values and the Western idea of human rights. So I think what you see happening in the China-Russia relationship is part of a much broader picture about where China is going in the world and where Chinese foreign policy is going to kind of bring that about.
I think that the last 10 days were a very clear setback for both China and Russia's aims vis-a-vis the global community, including the global South. You start with the ICC indictment, and I'll leave this to the China experts, but I wouldn't be surprised that if that indictment had come 4 or 6 hours, the Xi visit might have been delayed to allow some distance between that indictment and the visit. But of course, it came just after the announced visit, so he couldn't pull back. And the Chinese peace plan, I think, has very little credibility, even in the global South, because where's the outreach to Ukraine, right? That vaunted phone call we've been talking about for months and months and months, still has not happened. And the Chinese peace plan has proved to be another indicator of differences between Beijing and Moscow, because while Beijing has not done many of the things that Putin has asked for, Putin did not do the one thing that I think Xi might have liked on that visit, which is to unreservedly endorse Xi's peace plan. As Jill mentioned, Putin's support for it was rather tepid. He said it was consistent with Russian views, and it could be the basis. Now, there's a ringing endorsement if I've ever heard one. And keep in mind that the reason why Putin did not do that is that he's maintaining the maximalist objectives that he has had since the beginning of the big invasion, which is to establish effective political control over Ukraine. If he were willing to do the nuanced thing, which is why the United States was very concerned about the Chinese peace plan, which say, yes, I love this plan, ceasefire in place, let's go for it. He didn't do that. So he, to anyone who has eyes to see, is revealing once again his very, very aggressive designs. And even in the global South, where there may be some resentment to the United States, no, they're not blind. But I think the key, there's one more point I'd like to make, which is a little beyond your question. I think that the focus by observers that the global South is not with the West is actually not news. Anyone who studies history knows that there was something called the non-aligned movement, which sat on the fence during the Cold War, which we happened to win. And I suspect the global South will be as important today as the non-alignment movement was then. Not unimportant, but not in any way decisive in the battle over Ukraine and the future international order.
Those are great. Those are amazing observations, and they really have made me think about what the U.S. response should be. And I think that that's obviously an incredibly complex question. One thing that comes to my mind is, should the U.S. response, in terms of the messaging, right, the rhetorical goals that China and Russia have, should the response of the U.S. be to try to preserve this non-alignment, or if not get one side over to them, to preserve that non-alignment? Or what should the U.S. do in response to this kind of messaging?
Look, I think that United States diplomacy should be more energetic globally. And we obviously should be promoting our interests in a more energetic fashion. We understand, or we should understand, there are dynamics where we are simply not going to be popular. And I think that Michael pointed out the main one. Third world countries, or global South countries, which have an authoritarian leadership, don't like America's democracy preaching. But this just underscores that maybe we are in a battle between authoritarians and the democratic world. And in fact, I think we are. And I would make the point that the high watermark of the authoritarians was the Xi-Putin statement a few weeks before the big invasion, because the authoritarians have had a very bad 13 months since then. And the reason for that is Ukraine. So we now reach out to the global South, especially when we talk about, for example, the grain issue, where essentially Moscow is the one threatening them with famine. But they've not done a bad job at hiding that. Not a bad job, but not a great one. We need to be more persuasive in our presentation. We need to spend the time, lay out the arguments. And maybe at times we need to be a bit more sensitive to the specific requirements that our would-be partners in the global South have.
And I'll extend a version of that question to the other three panelists as well. In terms of China's the China-Russia relationship and their growing alignment, what should the U.S. response be there? Because that's an entirely different question. I know that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we were still talking about maybe trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia, and that seems totally unrealistic at this point. So what are the other options on the table? Perhaps, Michael, we can start with you.
Well, I think from Washington's perspective, I think the Biden administration has to start seeing this relationship between China and Russia for what it really is, which is an attempt by the world's two greatest authoritarian states to actively try to change the world order. And this is taking the growing confrontation with China to a very, very different level. And because it's increasingly becoming a battle not just over technology and trade and this kind of thing, but increasingly a battle over ideas and which coalition is going to shape the future of the global order and shape global governance. And I think because of that, the response of the United States has to be much more aggressive and much more targeted at selling the U.S. agenda, selling the benefits of the current world order, the importance of what the rules-based order, the benefits that it's brought to the world, including the global South. What is often, I think, forgotten is how important the U.S.-led world order has been to China's own development. When Xi Jinping was recently giving speeches about how Chinese modernization shows that modernization doesn't have to be Westernization. That's actually really not true. China's modernization is all about its relationship with the West. So the fact is that the U.S. and Europe, despite their domestic issues, despite the changing nature of the global balance of power, actually have a really good story to sell. And I think Washington and its allies have to do a better job of selling it.
You're totally right about that. I'm just nodding along. When I think, for example, about China's entry into the WTO, so many Americans flew to China and helped coach them and helped them get to that point, helped them do that application. It's just one example of so many. But please continue. I think I interrupted someone.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in and agree with everything that Michael said about those elements, but also, I think one aspect that is obviously critical, but which increasingly I think we kind of talk about secondarily, is the security dynamic here, right? I mean, we've all seen the fact that Russia has not succeeded in the way that many people expected militarily in Ukraine, but that does not mean that Russia is not a critical security partner for China, and that it complicates in many ways planning that U.S. defense planners and others are doing for future contingencies that could involve both China and Russia at the same time. So when we talk about how the United States needs to be preparing for the fact that we have a China-Russia relationship that is only getting closer, and I agree, I think it's, I don't think we should entirely give up on the areas of distance or daylight between China and Russia, but primarily we should be dealing with the fact that whatever you want to call this, an alliance, an entente, or just a very deep relationship where there's alignment of interests, it's going to be very problematic for the years ahead for the reasons that Michael lays out, but also because, Russia is still a nuclear superpower. Russia is still the PLA's most important military exercise partner, and that's only deepening. And they've continued to exercise together throughout this year as Russia has been unleashing its war on Ukraine. And we need to be working very closely with our European partners as well to start thinking through more how to deal with a multi-region, China-Russia scenario that could really complicate our ability to defend our interests in East Asia, in Europe, and beyond. And so that requires a lot more deep thinking about strategic planning, wargaming things out. And our recent nuclear posture review kind of acknowledged that it would be truly problematic if we had a problem of deterring both China and Russia at the same time. It didn't really give many solutions as to how we're going to deal with that. So we need to be thinking those problems through. And I know that that's happening in the U.S. government, but it needs to happen at a really extensive level.
I'll just jump in here. I tend to follow, messaging, strategic messaging, propaganda, et cetera. And I think that picking up on something that Michael was talking about, in so many places that I've been to in the former Soviet space, the thing that convinces people about where their interests should be is not, general ideas about Jeffersonian democracy. Not always. It's really, how am I living? Do I have a job? Can I travel? Can my kids get educated? Things like that. And so reminding people, that in the West and with trade with China, we really are living better. Everybody is living better. And focusing on just the payoffs from, I forget the word now for democracy for a minute, but just, free trade. And with China and the rest of the world. And then the other thing I think I would hone in on is, if I were Mr. Xi looking at President Putin, I would be worried. I mean, Putin is destabilizing things. This is not what China wants. China wants, at least as far as I understand, stability and progress. And, Putin is upsetting the apple cart everywhere you look. He's threatening nuclear weapons. And that is something that China specifically has said no one should do. He's in another country, has literally walked into another country, rolled into another country, which should make other countries a little worried about whether your neighbor could roll over the border and try to take you over. And I think there are places where the United States could really message better and just on a very practical basis, tell people that this, they can have a relationship, that's fine, but look at the fine print.
I'll just remind our audience really quickly that we are going to switch to the Q&A portion in a few minutes. I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions, and then I will start choosing those questions. So if you have one, go ahead and submit it to see if we have a chance to get to it. Jill, you have mentioned several times economic ties between China and Russia, since the Ukraine war broke out. Can you elaborate a little bit more on China's economic ties? I mean, one of the big concerns at the very beginning was that China would offer that economic lifeline, that they might even help do sanctions busting for Russia. What have we actually seen from the Chinese government, and then in practice from Chinese companies, from the Chinese financial system overall?
Yeah, I really can't get into great detail on this, but obviously from the Chinese perspective, it's energy. So that has increased in a major fashion that they are buying, Russian energy. Now, the things that they're providing to Putin that he really, really needs exactly are these high-tech components, things as I mentioned, for the average consumer. It could be cell phones and chips and things like that used commercially, but it's also high-tech components, that really the technology that can be used in weapons. And that is crucial for Putin because of sanctions not allowing those products to get into Russia. And so Putin really needs a source. He's got it in China. I think that is worrying, that, because Russia can't produce these, that it can simply turn to China. I would find that worrying. But the energy component will continue, there's no question. And but it's lopsided. I mean, if you look at Russia providing just kind of raw materials, I do not think that China buys much of anything else from Russia, because what does Russia produce other than energy? So
that's right. Which, for me leads to a broader question of beyond rhetorical space. what China is really getting from this. But I'll hold off on that because I want to ask David and Michael, our China experts, on that question. As I mentioned, there were concerns that China would do sanctions busting. To my knowledge, we have not seen that on a large scale. And in fact, there's the major Chinese banks are mostly, following sanctions. But if you can maybe talk to me a little bit about Xi Jinping's calculus on how far to go in terms of avoiding sanctions, and what we're seeing in terms of the yuan and other elements of that. Over to Michael and David.
I think the situation with sanctions from China's perspective is similar in regard to providing direct military support to Russia's war effort, which is something like crossing the Rubicon. I mean, I think if you're going if China is going to directly aid Russia in that kind of way, I think that very much changes the relationship between China and Russia, and it's going to very much change the relationship between the US, Europe, and China. That has been made very, very clear to China. And I think that's why, as far as we know, those things haven't happened yet. The Chinese are having economic issues of their own. They don't necessarily want to face the kind of sanctions that they would almost certainly face if they did cross that Rubicon. And I think the way of looking at the China-Russia economic relationship overall is that, in kind of very broad terms, is that it's serving a purpose for both countries, which is the process of decoupling from the US and Europe and its partners. Not completely, of course, but shifting the level of reliance that China and Russia have had on the West for trade and their economic growth and development, and finding new patterns of trade to support their development that aren't reliant on the West. This is so, from China's perspective, the relationship with Russia is very much part of its self-reliance program and its agenda to decrease its vulnerabilities in the global economy, and that specifically means the U.S. and U.S. economic power.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say, I mean, yes, we've seen indications that China is providing, dual-use equipment, drones, body armor, other things to Russian defense companies. That we know that there's a fair amount flowing across the border in terms of semiconductors, not the highest end type of semiconductors that could support a lot of Russian military equipment, but that's significant too. But I think that at the end of the day, and I think Michael was touching on this, when we talk about what China gets out of this and where the kind of limits are, I think at this point they're doing everything possible they can to ensure that Russia doesn't entirely fail in Ukraine without crossing that line to putting them in the domain where they're going to get really hit by sanctions. I think that cost benefit analysis could shift significantly if China were to determine that Russia truly were about to fail, right? And that could have potential implications for stability of Russia. I mean, when we talk about the importance to China of Russia, it's not just the benefits that they get, and we've talked about that in the kind of messaging and the global order and the security domains, but it's also in a negative sense, right? This is a 4,000-kilometer border that China has not had to worry about, and they could focus their energies security-wise to the east, to the south with India, and globally. And in the event that you have potential for instability in Russia, that could create all kinds of headaches for China, and worst case scenario for China, a more U.S. friendly Russia in some sort of replacement for the Putin regime. So that aspect, and then also the fact, as Michael mentioned, that we hear from Xi Jinping repeatedly now, and this was the core theme of the 20th Party Congress speech that he gave about security vulnerability in the event, we assume he means in the event of a Taiwan Strait crisis with the United States. The need for energy inputs, the need for food inputs, right? All these things that Russia can help provide across that border if the United States were to cut things off in other ways. So that is really a critical part of this relationship, and a real reason why China is going to continue to support Russia and make sure that it does not ultimately fail. And we'll see if that, if they feel like that has changed, and then they have to go well beyond what they've already done and risk sanctions violation in the way that they haven't up to now.
I think this is a great moment to switch to the Q&A portion. And there's this, I'll start with a question from George Groman. I think it's a great question. Does the panel believe that the US has the staying power, given future Democratic administration changes, to persistently combat the long-term authoritarian goals of the China-Russia alliance? And can we do this prior to actual physical confrontation?
I'll take a shot at that.
Go for it.
I don't think the United States has any choice but to work very hard to ensure that neither Russia nor China can undermine our vital interests. And those vital interests include the maintenance of the order which we helped build, and which is responsible not just for the relative peace of the past 75 years, relative, of course, no great power wars, but also the extraordinary prosperity, as we talked about before. At this point, I think about 10%, 9% of the world lives in extreme poverty. That figure was 70% in 1950, 30% in 1970, I believe. So the whole world has risen because of the peace and the openness of trade, as well as, of course, technological change of the past 75 years. And I think we have no choice but to make sure, partly for the reasons that David outlined, that Putin loses in Ukraine. If Putin were to win in Ukraine, this means the authoritarians are successfully marching. And I don't have any doubt that the United States does have the means to do this if the United States has the will. The Biden administration has done what I consider to be an adequate job preventing a Russian defeat, but the policy could be stronger because we'd be making it certain, preventing a Ukrainian defeat, but we could make sure that there is a Russian defeat, a Ukrainian victory, if we did more. I think that the strength of the alliance, and you have to credit Washington for this, has not just given Putin an unpleasant surprise, but Xi. And I think Xi wonders if 30-year-old American technology is defeating the Russian army in Ukraine, what would modern American technology do to Chinese amphibious operation against Taiwan? And by the same token, I think that the administration's timidity on responding to Putin's nuclear threats has persuaded China that absolutely has to become a peer power of the United States and Russia with nuclear weapons. All of these things mean that, again, we have a vital interest in making sure that the containment of these two rogue powers works. And again, we have the physical, meaning we have the economic, we have the military, we have the diplomatic sway to do this if we have the will. And so maybe that's the basis of George's question. I think Biden kind of understands it. I think the internationalist Republicans are stronger than Biden on this. The problem, of course, is with the isolationist strain in the Republican Party, which right now remains small, but we have to watch this. Thank you.
I can just jump in here. I think I agree with everything John said. I think that was great. I would add too, the importance, and we were all kind of touched on this a little bit, of the alliance network, right? And how important that needs to be for the United States, regardless of who is the president of the United States. And I think that's been underscored over the last year with our ability to impose sanctions jointly with our allies on Russia. It's also been underscored, just in the last couple of weeks, where we had Japanese Prime Minister Kishida in Ukraine just around the same time as she was in Putin for his meeting with, in Moscow for his meeting with Putin, really underscored the fact that this is not just a US-led mission. This is not just the US and NATO. This is the democratic world really seeing this as a challenge that we all need to face up to together. And you see this reflected in the way in which, Xi and Putin in their statements were, all up in arms again about NATO and about so-called bloc Cold War thinking. and about the fact that you have not just that happening with NATO, but you also have a lot more progress with our alliances in Asia, right? Through AUKUS, through our work with the Quad. And that is really concerning and frightening for autocrats and for the PRC in Russia. And I think that's a way to ensure that we can deal with this massive challenge that we're facing from autocracies, and do so in a way that we can kind of prioritize, share burdens with allies, and deal with this problem together, and also make sure that it's a shared messaging effort and not just the United States, and don't make the effort that China and Russia are trying to undertake, as we've discussed, to try to shape the discourse and the narrative. Don't make that easier for them. Make sure that this is a multi-party democratic effort.
I want to combine a few questions here, and John also had briefly touched on this. Several of the people in the audience have asked about Taiwan. So what are there implications? And if so, what are the implications for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's support for Russia, on Taiwan's future?
Michael, you want to take that, or I can jump in?
I could start. I've actually, I personally have thought that the link between the Ukraine war and the Taiwan situation has been a little bit overblown. But there's a couple ways of kind of slicing it. I mean, one is that yes, the guys in Beijing are looking at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine in regard to their situation with Taiwan. And that's why when you see a lot of the messaging that comes out, whether it's the 12-point peace plan or the global security initiative and all these things that the Chinese are doing, when they talk about territorial integrity and sovereignty and all these issues in that context, they're actually really talking about Taiwan. At the same time, I think there's a very good chance that what Xi Jinping is taking away from watching what's happening to Russia in Ukraine is the risks of trying a military operation to claim Taiwan, both in terms of the difficulty of doing this, but also in terms of what was mentioned earlier, in terms of the response from the U.S. and its allies, which I think did somewhat take Beijing by surprise. I think Xi and his team had this image that the alliance was strained and breaking down and was maybe on its last legs, and that's been proven very much not to be the case. That the U.S. and the allies can rally when they really want to. And he has to be worried that if he tries a military assault on Taiwan, that this rejuvenated coalition of global democracies is going to turn on him in the same way that it's turned on Putin.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just add, I think the lessons that I think it is important to say that this is not a one-to-one comparison. But some of what John touched on, I think, is also important to note in terms of the threat of nuclear use or limited nuclear use that Putin has tried to employ with Ukraine. I think China has absolutely taken some lessons from that in a Taiwan Strait crisis scenario. To what extent it could use some similar tactics to try to keep the United States from intervening. I think that's a key lesson that China is kind of wrestling with. I think absolutely the vulnerability as a result of what they've watched the kind of U.S.-led allied response to be, and I think that we've touched on that earlier, but really trying to mitigate its vulnerability in the event of a crisis, not just in the security domain, but also in the financial domain, and trying to work with partners like Russia on de-dollarization and trying to make China less vulnerable to the fact that it's a dollar-centric financial system and what that could mean for sanctions. So there are significant lessons learned. And I think China's also thinking through in ways that it hadn't before. And of course, we all know that things have been happening on the Taiwan side at the same time, right? So with Speaker Pelosi's visit, and what we've seen China do there, I think they're thinking through in lots of ways things short of a full-scale military invasion in the blockade domain, in the quarantine domain, in the kind of cyber attack domain, and how that would play out, and how the United States could or could not respond and intervene in those kinds of scenarios.
I have a question here about how Russia's actions how the long-term effect on energy flows in the world, and if it destabilizes sort of the energy trade. And that question is from Ferdous and Taj.
Well, maybe I'll jump in since it's Russia. I think at the moment, it's full steam ahead for Russia. However, there are areas where they are drilling where they need Western technology, especially in severe climates in the far north. And a lot of those components and machinery are under sanctions. So that's a problem, I think, long-term, medium term for Putin. And then long-term, you have to look at China trying to go green to a certain extent. And Russia is continuing to think that the world will operate on carbon. So I think quite long-term, we've got a problem for Russia's significance to China. I mean, if it is a supplier of energy and the energy changes, is Russia really relevant anymore? And I also wanted to pick up on something that David mentioned, which I think is really important. The Chinese, I think, are to a great extent playing a much more subtle game than Putin is. And if you look at the problems, anyone analyzing Russia right now knows that Putin has really serious problems and knows that there is a certain amount of chaos behind the scenes. This war is not going well, and Putin is beginning to get some criticism at home. And so I think, Xi, looking at that situation, might have, a little red flag for the stability of Russia itself. And do you want to jump into, an even deeper relationship with a country that, has instability and has technical problems? So I think there's a lot of thought that Xi has to go through in this relationship.
We have time for one more question. And this one is from Christian Marcel Filea. And it's to David and Michael. How exactly do you see the role that China hopes to give Russia in the event of an open conflict in the South China Sea and the Pacific with the United States? But I think anyone can also jump in on this question.
Well, I mean, my sense of things right now is that, it's very clear that the China-Russia relationship is not an alliance. There's no mutual defense element here. I think that I know there's some strategists in the US are worried that China may benefit from certain Russian military technology, especially in the naval area, or that perhaps Russia could give China, access to ports and things like that in the event of some kind of military conflict. But for me, at this point, I'd be curious to see what David thinks of this. Is that the idea that Russia and China are going to somehow fight a war together for some reason? I don't think that's really on the table in their relationship at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I don't think there would be an expectation if there was war in the South China Sea that Russia and China would be fighting side by side. There's a lot of complications for that to happen, and including the fact that Russia has a fairly decent relationship with Vietnam and some other countries in the region. But I think more importantly, what we could expect to see is a Russia that steps up its game in terms of attempting to distract the United States from fully focusing on whatever conflict we're talking about in the South China Sea. And that is one of the most important elements for China of the relationship, is Russia's continued ability to prevent the United States to focus most of, or the majority of, its energy on China and on countering China's aggression in East Asia. So I think that's where we would potentially see Russia undertaking actions in the European theater, or potentially further north in Northeast Asia. We can't exactly posit what it would look like, but ways in which that it would complicate U.S. and allied responses to what China's doing in the event of a Taiwan Strait crisis or something else in the South China Sea.
Okay, well, that wraps up our time this morning. I would like to thank all of our panelists today for joining us. John, Jill, Michael, David, thank you for your time and for your insights. And I hope that everyone joins the Atlantic Council for their future events. Thank you so much.